It's time for the Science Cafe!
Learn about the latest technologic innovations today.
And you don't have to pay.
Expert panels with advanced degrees are sure to satisfy your curiosity.
Since we mention it's free.
And if you think you'll find a better time than this, then come on down and test your hypothesis. Cause you're gonna learn a lot if you wanna stay down at the Science Cafe.
Good evening and welcome to Science Cafe, New Hampshire. My name is Dan Marchak. I'm one of the organizers of this event. We are recording it, thanks to Access Nashua for helping us do that. And the reason that we do that is because we want Science Cafe to be seen by a lot of people. So the easiest way for us to do that is to capture it on video and produce these. Then they're put on Nashua cable, but they're also distributed nationally and are downloaded in 12 states. So the conversations that we have here are getting spread across the country and maybe starting other conversations. So I also think that's a nice outcome. How many people have not been to a Science Cafe before? Oh, wow, that's quite a few. All right, so we don't have PowerPoint, we don't have presentations, we don't have lectures, we don't have anything like that. What we have is question and answer. So most of the time is spent answering the questions that you may have or the questions that may come into your head while we're talking. So to start off, I'm going to ask each of the panelists, and we have 4 panelists tonight, to introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about how they came to be at this table. We have John Wagner from Spyglass, sorry. And we have Summer from Anheuser-Busch. Cheryl Parker, interestingly, runs the brewing program at the University of New Hampshire. And Michael is from the Lithermans. All right, so with that, I will start with the ladies and work our way around.
So my name's Cheryl, and I started the brewing science program at UNH about 2 years ago. And prior to that, I was a brewer for Throwback Brewery, and I got into it really from the home brewing perspective. I was a scientist before that, so I come at it with a very scientific background, and that's what I want to really teach to the students. But we also get into production. We have a full running brewery that's licensed. We make beer, we sell beer. We should have had a beer on tap tonight, but my whole crew is on summer break.
Hi, my name's Summer Anderson. I'm the Brewmaster at the Merrimack Brewery for Anheuser-Busch. I've been with AB for 14 years now. I've worked in our St. Louis brewery, our Syracuse, New York brewery, in our corporate office, and now I am the Brewmaster at the Merrimack Brewery, and very happy to be here tonight. I have been in brewing my entire career with AB, and everything I've known about beer I've actually learned through Anheuser-Busch. Before that, I actually have a degree in mechanical engineering and has nothing to do with making beer other than I know how to solve problems and how equipment works. So,
hi, I'm John Wagner from Spyglass. We're down the road here, in case you didn't know. Got into brewing by home brewing, which a lot of people have. Probably started in 1990, and then made a living as a software engineer until, well, still do. But a year ago, 3 of my friends and I opened Spyglass. I'm trying to think why at this point, but it's a lot of work, but it's also been pretty fun.
Hi, everybody. My name is Michael. People call me MHP because I have an unpronounceable last name, Hauptly-Pierce. I got into brewing about 10 years ago. My current business partner and I we worked together. He was my sales rep, and we started hanging out, listening to music. Both had a love of old school hip hop, and started recording tracks in the basement. We did that for about 4 years, probably 30 cuts. Thankfully, they're no longer findable. The last site that hosted them, I think, got shut down intentionally because we were on it. So we quickly found that we made much better beer than hip-hop and started homebrewing, scaled up, wrote a business plan. Took a real long time. Opened our doors about 4 years ago. When we opened, it was just myself and my partner. We both had full-time jobs, sales jobs, 50, 60 hours a week, and did this on top of it, so we both wore all the hats. Now we've gotten to a point where we divided and conquered, and we have a production team, and I'm the sales team. So I mostly make the beer disappear while I have amazing people behind the scenes making it appear constantly. And this is our first time being here with beer, so thank you guys.
Each of the breweries brought a beer to be featured here tonight, and I'd like to give them a chance right up front, as you consider ordering them, to tell you a little bit about them. And this time, I guess we'll go from one end to the other. Oh, and Cheryl at the UNH program, they brew beer too, so I expect her to tell you about what they offer.
So at Spyglass, we specialize in hazy IPAs, essentially, as much as we can. State Machine is one of the first IPAs we brewed, actually, and State Machine Citra's the beer we've rebrewed the most over the 9 months we've been open. And it's a pretty simple IPA that features Citra hops mainly. And we also make other versions like Mosaic and Vic Secret. We use that beer to actually get to know a hop, so we can use that hop other places.
We have Shock Top today. So Shock Top is a Belgian white. It's about 5.2% ABV. Not about, it is 5.2% ABV and 10 IBU. It's a very light, refreshing beer. We use lemon, lime, and orange peel as well as coriander, all added to the brew kettle and all mixed up in the, yeah, I don't know. It's really a great summer beer. We do serve it all year round, but if you haven't tried it before, you can have an orange in it, you can not have an orange in it, whatever your preference. But it's got a nice citrus flavor with some hint bitterness at the end, but really smooth overall.
So at UNH, we started selling beer last year. We're fully licensed, both federally and state. And we sell locally in Durham, and if you ever want to, and we also sell growlers out of the brewery on a limited basis. And if you ever want to find out when our growler days are, you could go to Facebook and we're at UNH Brew Lab, or just UNH Brew Lab, whatever. Right now, I do have beer. It's in a tank, and I don't have kegs to put it in. And it's a wheat beer, so maybe just as well that I didn't bring it. It will be at festivals this fall. Passport, Seacoast Microbrew, a few other things. And then when the students come back, they'll start creating a whole bunch of beers and brewing a whole bunch of beers for the semester. I always give them either an ingredient or idea they need to start with, and then they can kind of run with coming up with a recipe. One of the things we're doing this semester that I want them to do right off the bat is work with the dining hall to use some of the bread that the students don't eat, like the dining halls, they won't eat the ends of the bread, and you can brew beer with that. So I want them to make an unloved bread end beer of some sort that will then go back to the dining hall to cook the food with for our harvest dinner.
We brew a lot of Belgian beers. We used to brew as homebrewers a style where we didn't sparge, so essentially instead of mixing the grains with water and then running that liquid off and running some more hot water through those grains to rinse out all the liquid, we would take that first amount of liquid and make a big beer with it, like a double IPA or a barley wine or a stock ale. And then we'd get some more hot water, maybe add a little bit of fresh grains, but mostly just run that hot water through the grains and get a much smaller, simpler, not as malt-forward beer. And saisons are one of the styles that we would often do that way because it really lent itself to the style. The style is really more about the yeast flavor versus a malt profile or a hop profile. You're going to get some cloves, some banana, maybe a little Bazooka Joe bubblegum. It develops in the area that is now right where France and Belgium border each other. It was originally brewed slightly lower than this. This is 5.1. It would have been brewed to like 3.5% traditionally, and mostly given to farmhands as they were working because you couldn't drink the water. They would brew it with seasonal ingredients to keep it cheap because it was the farmhands, and that's why they called it a saison. That's Belgique for season. We chose to add a little bit of rye. We were going to change it every time we made it, and when we opened with this beer, we loved it so much that we haven't changed it in 4 years. So very simple. I would like to say traditional, except maybe a little more high test at 5.1%. Oh, and it's of course named after a song because we were a hip hop group, so everything's got to be musically referenced. So it's Tangled Up in Bruges.
All right, so now we'll get to your questions.
Sometimes I get a little confused between ales and lagers and whatevers. And I know if you could just give us the Reader's Digest version of how the process works.
How the process works for brewing. Well, I do about 80 to 100 hours with the students on that, so I'll try to condense it, or maybe I'll just pass it this summer.
I picked you.
So the process of brewing, how many people are home brewers here? Yeah, I figured there were a lot, and who knows absolutely nothing about how beer is made? Okay, good. That's who I'll talk to. So you're basically going to take your malted grain. You can't take barley right off the field. You have to malt it first. You have to get the kernels ready, all the starch packed in there and ready. And then in the brew house, the brewer's going to crush that grain. You can't take barley right from the field. You need to malt it first, and that goes through a malt house. And interestingly, we didn't have malt houses east of the Mississippi since Prohibition. They started opening back up again in 2012, starting with Valley Malt in Massachusetts. So that was a big gap if you wanted to be an all local locally sourced brewery here. So you have to, the farmers have to send the grain to a malt house. And in the malt house, you're basically germinating. You get the grain wet and you let it germinate. It starts to turn into a plant, and then you kiln dry it and you stop that process. And what you're trying to do is maximize how much starch is in that kernel. And basically, the starch is what we're going to turn into sugar, and the sugar we're going to turn into alcohol. The yeast are going to turn into alcohol. So the more starch you have to start, the better. You take that malt into the brew house, you crush it to get all that starch accessible, and then you mix that grain with hot water. And depending on the temperature of water you mix it with, you might make, it'll make different types of sugar chains, right? So if you want a sweet beer, you're going to mash at one temperature. If you want a dry beer, you'll mash at a different temperature. We could get into that later if anyone wants to, but... and then after you've done that, you're going to run off that, it's called sweet wort. You're going to run that off and then rinse that grain off and put that all into your boil kettle. And you're going to boil that liquid for an hour. And it's during that hour where you start adding hops. You're going to add hops at the beginning of the hour if you want to add bitterness to your beer. And you're going to add hops towards the end if you want to add aroma. And that's because it takes a long time of boiling to turn those, to turn the hops, to make them bitter, basically. And by that time, all the nice aromas are gone, so you got to add hops again at the end if you want some aroma to your beer. So like those New England IPAs right now, we're adding very little hops at the beginning and a whole ton of hops at the end. And then from there, you cool down that liquid, you put it in a fermenter, and add your yeast. And it's actually yeast that makes beer. It's not brewers. Brewers make wort, yeast make beer. And if you're making an ale, it'll ferment from 3 days to a week. It ferments at a warm temperature. If you're making a lager, like they make Budweiser being a good lager, you add lager yeast, and that's more like 4 weeks of fermentation for you guys, 30 days. And after that, you might put it in a maturation tank, carbonate it, keg it, drink it. It's most. We could go into more detail, maybe. Was that a good synopsis?
Yeah, I think that was pretty good. I guess the only thing I'll say is traditionally, like ales and lagers are the two main categories of beer. Every beer falls into one of those two categories. There is nothing outside of those categories, at least not that we've found yet.
There's a lot of strains that used to just hang out in small areas and get used by populations that really didn't get exposed to the rest of the world. In Scandinavia, former Eastern Bloc countries, there's this whole group of yeasts called Kveik, Kviek, that have very unique properties and are totally different from lager yeast and ale yeast, or even the Brettanomyces that can infect our beer. If you're Belgian, you would add intentionally. But no one really knows where to put them taxonomically speaking. They're not like, it used to be just the sort of the binary conversation of is it an ale or is it a lager, because they were two separate species and they had very different characteristics. But now you can actually sort of design your own yeast strain. If you have enough cubic dollars, you can have a yeast lab take this little piece of this strain and this little piece of this strain and this characteristic from this strain, and I want it to make clove, but I don't want it to make banana. I want it to flocculate, but you can kind of custom make a yeast strain at this point. So I think we're going to find that those lines get even more blurred.
Two questions for you, Cheryl. One, you talked about more of a point than a question, but you talked about using the ends of the bread for them to brew. Have you thought about using your spent grain for the food service side to make bread from?
Yes. So that is going to be included in our harvest dinner on October 16th, which is university-wide. And they're going to make the beer from the bread ends, and then we're going to give the beer back to them and the spent grain. So they're going to make the bread, and then they're going to like braise the beef or something with the beer, and it's going to be like a whole full cycle thing.
And the other question, what's the size of your brew system? Is it a pilot brew system or a full-scale system?
We have a 1-barrel system and a 3-barrel system.
Cool.
That's 31 gallons for the 1 barrel and 93 for the 3 barrel. It's sort of an archaic measurement system that's left over from, who knows, it was probably like the size of the king's bathtub at some point or something. But we're kind of stuck with it. So the kegs that you might remember standing on your hands on in college or not, those are half barrels. Those are 15 and a half gallons, and that's half of a barrel. In most of our reporting and most of our shorthand and conversations, we talk about capacity in terms of barrels. It's 31 gallons.
Hi, can you tell me where porters and stouts fit in the beer spectrum?
Porters and stouts are essentially ales, as far as that spectrum, the binary lager or ale, except Baltic porter, which is a lager, I believe. Beyond that, the big debate, or in my head, and I've never really heard a clear answer, is what's the difference? The best one I've heard is porters are from England, stouts are from Ireland. But we could probably get 3 other opinions on that.
I've heard, and it's probably anecdotal, that porters were originally designed as more of a blend between stouts and lighter ales. For porters, the actual guys that held the doors open, that was their drink of choice, and that's why it got named after them.
So now that we got the brewing process out of the way and people understand what's going on, for each of the various breweries that you guys have, what is the most technically challenging beer that you guys make, and why is it technically challenging?
So for us, it's Budweiser. Budweiser is American lager. It's very light in profile. It really cannot hide any defects, so every part of the process has to be perfect in order for it to be consistent. We're also trying to brew it across 65 breweries in the world. And so for us to have that consistency when you go have a beer across overseas or even in California or say in Massachusetts that maybe wasn't brewed in Merrimack, who knows, it has to be consistent. And so to be that consistent, you have to have a lot of control. You have to have a lot of precision. You have to know exactly what your raw material changes are going to do because everybody has to deal with raw material changes, crop years change, et cetera. And so you have to be able to accommodate that to get the same final product. So we're not changing recipes, but we're modifying for what raw materials are coming in. Same processes, same yeast strain since we started brewing Budweiser. And really just because it's so light and so crisp, you cannot hide anything. So any defect at all is an issue.
I would tell you there's been an explosion of local breweries and organizations like I've never seen before. What do you attribute this major change? Maybe it isn't 10 years, maybe it's 5, maybe it's 12, I don't know. But my recollection was that this didn't exist 10 or 15 years ago. What's going on?
There have been a couple of waves of small brewery expansion. There was one in the mid-'80s when it was craft brew versus nano brew, or that was sort of a boom and then almost immediately a recollapse. And then we saw a little bit of that happening around the late 90s, and then once again it was sort of a boom and a recollapse. In other markets, it was happening much more rapidly than it was happening here, and that was mostly due to legislation. We had a change in legislation in, was it 2011 that the Nano Act was passed? And essentially what that did is it did a lot of things for breweries my size specifically and smaller than my size, where it lowered the barrier to entry by giving you a less expensive license. Not a big deal, but $1,000 a year can be a big deal to a small business. It also allows for self-distribution, which pretty much since Prohibition was repealed has been built into most states' constitutions that legally breweries are not allowed, for the public good, of course, to sell their beer directly to either other enterprises or to the consumer. There needs to be an intermediary of a distributor to make sure that we don't poison you guys. So they allowed us under this Nano Act to self-distribute, which is an enormous margin benefit to a small business like us. It enables us to get in front of people, sell beer, deliver that beer, be the primary point of contact. It's not necessarily a scalable business model. You couldn't be Anheuser-Busch and self-distribute. You just couldn't do it. You couldn't be Great North in Manchester and self-distribute. They're just too big to make it make sense. But we're able to make it make sense, and while we're able to, it's really beneficial to our bottom line because we don't have to pay somebody to drive our beer and still pay somebody to sell our beer at the same time. So those two things really changed the landscape. After a couple of years, they put an addendum on that allowed people with a Nano license to apply for a Nano Plus, which gave you the ability to actually serve pints. Because before that, as a Nano, you could do 1 4-ounce sample per variety, per person, per day. And that was it. I mean, no one was looking at receipts when they audited you, but you don't break the law because you don't want to lose your license because that's your business. And that enabled us to then be able to serve pints. And so now our tasting room is one of our biggest revenue centers. So it's been a progressive awareness of the needs of the small brewery community and the legislation actually backing us up that has changed, I think, what's happening in New Hampshire specifically in the last 10 years.
Across the country, you'll see hotspots for craft breweries. And it's different places. It's kind of coming about later than 10 years, and that has to do with like New Hampshire specifically has certain laws, but then Maine has different laws, and Illinois has different laws, and depending on which ones and when they changed them, you have like different explosions of craft breweries during different times.
I think the only thing I'll add to that, I think, is beer is also following the inherent market trends, right? Everything you have, you can get 100 varieties of it. If you look at the vodka on the shelf, I bet you there's 15 flavors over there somewhere. So we're just, beer is part of that. Everybody wants variety. Everybody wants choices. Everybody wants something different, something new. I think it's really exciting to see the new styles. Sours were not really a big thing until probably 2 years ago. Maybe less than that, and then they kind of took off. And so the different styles that are emerging and the different experiments that people are doing and the different profiles that people are building is really exciting, and I think it just shows the choice that people want to have in the market.
So you were saying you brew all over the world, so I assume you can get hops and all the other ingredients sent to wherever you're brewing. What about the water? Because water is different everywhere, different.
And our process to clarify it, adjust it to make sure that it's got the right specifications is one of our most important processes. So we need to make sure that the water quality in New Hampshire, which we have great water here, so we have to do very little to treat it to get to the end result that we want. But that's got to be the same as in Brazil or in France or wherever the water source is, or LA. There's a lot of treatment that has to happen in different parts of the country and the world to get that same quality water, but the water is key. If the water was different everywhere, the beer would be different.
Yeah, it's one of the things I teach about 4 weeks about water in our intro class. And I bring up Budweiser a lot for that very reason. They have to have their product taste the same no matter where you are in the world, so they have to make sure the water's the same. And for craft brewers, it's a little bit different. You can really use the water you have and just do small adjustments depending on the style of beer you're making. But one of the reasons styles really came about around the world was because of the water quality. And if you're going to open, not necessarily the quality, but like the minerals and things, the composition of the water. So if you're in Ireland versus Pilsen, we have two very different water profiles that make two very different beers. Today, we could just add different minerals and things and salts to our beer, to our water, to make the beer style we want. So that's one of the things the students have to do. Again, going back to that recipe thing, they have to do all that chemistry by hand and show me all their work to make that water profile for the beer they want to make. But I also teach them about, if you're going to open a brewery somewhere, that's the number one thing you really have to consider, because it's the one thing you can't change. You can change where you order your grain, your hops, your yeast from, but you can never change where you get your water from. So if you just, dropped $1 million on some beautiful property and the water doesn't work for you, or there's something wrong with it, or you don't have enough of it, it's a really big problem.
Within the last 5 or 10 years, we've seen a huge explosion in the number of styles that are available: sours, saisons, farmhouse, all the things that are available to consumers. What's on your horizons? What new kinds of styles are we going to be seeing from you folks?
I wait till the students tell me what they want to make, because they seem to know what the future is better than I do. I was like, what do you want to make? They're like, yeah, it's this thing. We're going to put milk sugar and it's going to be like a frap. And I'm like, what? And then, don't you know it, 4 months later, everyone's doing milkshake IPAs. I'm like, what? So I'm going to start listening to them.
Our flagship is a New England style IPA. It's over half of our overall capacity. It's definitely the beer that keeps the lights on. It's what you generally find on tap from us if you find us on tap. But it's not the only thing we enjoy. We definitely enjoy drinking that. We only make beer that we don't enjoy, that we do enjoy. There's a lot of styles that we don't make because we just don't like them. We're never going to make a brown ale because I'm just not such a brown ale fan. I'm sorry. We're never going to make a black IPA. I don't like the way that really dark roasted malt pairs with hop aroma. Neither does my partner. So we don't make that. We're fortunate in that we get to really play outside of the star. We get to play in a few areas that we really enjoy, and they're quite popular. Sours are another area. We have 4 sours on tap out of 12 at our brewery right now. And they're kettle sours, so traditionally speaking, to kind of geek out on styles a little bit, before people understood yeast, before Louis Pasteur, there were some styles that traditionally involved inviting bacteria that makes lactic acid, like they would use for yogurt or kimchi or sauerkraut, inviting that into the process at some point and allowing it to sour either the grains or the wort or the beer by doing its thing. And people didn't really understand what was happening, but they knew sort of how to facilitate it. It was a black box, but they understood where the switch was, right? And they would either include those microorganisms, we call them bugs in the industry oftentimes, and that can mean both wild yeast and souring bacteria. They would either introduce the bugs in the mash tun or in the wort in the kettle before they boiled it, or they would wait until it was completely done fermenting and then they would put it in barrels, which would often just be infected because, once again, people didn't understand proper sanitation and microbiology, and they would just have resident bacteria or wild yeast in these barrels. And those two styles developed sort of very separate from each other. The wild secondary fermentation is almost uniquely a Belgian phenomenon before, say, the last 20 years. There was some stuff happening just across the English Channel in England that was very parallel to what was happening in Belgium in the late 17 and early 1800s. But aside from that, most of the rest of England was not dealing with funky stuff, any bugs at all. In Germany, there were a couple of regions that did include souring bacteria in their hot side process, so their brewing process versus their post-fermentation process. Berliner Weizen, or Berliner Weiss, is a style from Berlin that would be made to about 4% alcohol. It would allow some acidification from this bacteria to happen generally before it was boiled, and then they would actually serve it with syrup. So when you ordered a pint of this, they would serve it mit Stuss, where they'd give you either Woodruff syrup or raspberry syrup, or kind of depending on what was seasonal and local. Americans have taken that style and really turned it on its head, because you can't package beer with sugar in the package, although breweries do it. I do not. Like, never mind, that's a whole nother tangent. It ferments and it explodes and people get mad. So we had to find a way as Americans to still make it really fruit forward, and so we now add the fruit generally in the fermentation tank a couple of days into fermentation, so you get a very fruit forward sour beer, but not sweet at all. And the other style was really more what you're going to see from like Russian River, or Allagash is known worldwide for their Belgian wild style beers, and that's something that I think we're going to see more and more of as styles evolve and people get the reserves and the patience to put stuff in a barrel and wait 2, 3, 4 years for it to functify and get ready to package. And you never make your money back on that beer. You charge $35 a bottle, and people are like, oh my goodness, $35. You're like, if you knew how many times I moved that liquid and then had to sanitize everything before and everything after.
I think there's a couple things, and you guys could speak to this. In New Hampshire, we have the highest per capita beer consumption in the country, I believe. And so we're hearty beer drinkers, but the growth of the industry, particularly in New Hampshire, which I've seen since probably the 1990s, early 1990s, has skyrocketed. And I think part of that, and I assume, you look at the panel, 2 out of the 4 are local breweries. There's a drive towards local in almost everything now, shopping-wise, whether that's going to farmers markets or beer. So maybe you guys could speak to that.
I used to sell beer at the farmers market, so I guess I'll start. When I worked for Throwback, and I absolutely agree with that. I think there's a culture now of wanting to know who's making your products, whether it's food or drinks, and really having a connection to where that comes from. And I hope that continues. I think it's a really cool thing.
I think the fact that we get to engage with a lot of our public directly and do grassroots storytelling, it ties right in with that locavorianism that we're seeing. And it's not just millennials. It's my parents' generation. It's my generation. It's everybody is thinking a little bit more just because they're realizing how much they throw away or how far something traveled, or thinking about the fact that maybe their neighbor has a farm and they should be buying something from their neighbor because they want their neighbor to keep their house instead of whoever owns stock in whatever. It's just caring about the people around you immediately and intensely, and wanting to actually spend your dollars based on that versus wanting to spend it where you can spend it cheaper. You can get cheaper beer than craft beer, certainly. You can get cheap craft beer, but I think you can also get a cheap loaf of bread. But do you want a cheap loaf of bread if you really want something that you're going to put some nice cheese on, or you're going to toast it? It's about finding what you want, and I think people are increasingly willing to do that.
Going back to before Prohibition, we had all these little breweries. Each town had a little brewery, and it was a community center, and now we have that back again, and I think that's a really cool thing. And what I've noticed is that the breweries host events, and even at Budweiser, there's a beer garden, and they have the dog nights and the different events and music. It becomes a gathering place for people, and I think that's something we were really lacking since Prohibition, so I'm really happy it's back, and I very much expect that to stay. I can't imagine that going away tomorrow.
MHP talked about the rules kind of for how you define wine in France. There is certainly a set of rules with the BJCP guidelines for what beer is supposed to be. I'm interested in the take that you guys have on that, and that trying to nail down the qualities of beer and how that contrasts or compares or relates to your creative brewing.
Sure. Well, those guidelines, they're just that, right? Guidelines, and they're more of, well, what's the character of the beer supposed to be like? A lot of, New England IPAs came out, right? And they're way less bitter than IPAs were, described in these guidelines. And so cloudy, right? That wouldn't have been acceptable. But now they've invented the new styles and put it back in. So I see like it's a kind of a circular thing. We don't care too much about the guidelines. We want to make stuff that we like and that our customers like. And we'll use whatever ingredients that we need to. The guidelines really don't say what the ingredients are anyway. So, I think the industry now is going, and this kind of gets back to what we were talking about, where it's getting really, milkshake IPAs, or these crazy things are coming up. I think some of that is maybe people trying to distinguish themselves because there are a lot more breweries. But I think some of it is just that, wow, that's really, that's, someone will taste and go, that's really awesome. I don't know what style it is. I don't care. What if I did this to it, and take it up another step?
Regarding the proliferation of microbrews again, don't I remember right that maybe Ronald Reagan signed a law that made... Carter. I was close. Let's give it up for Jimmy Carter.
And I think that was absolutely one of the greatest catalysts to the whole craft movement that came from 1980 onward, including what we're currently seeing. Because you look at the first people that opened those first breweries, you look at McAuliffe and Grossman in California with Sierra Nevada and New Albion, and then not too long after that, Fritz Maytag with Anchor Steam. And those guys, well, Fritz Maytag had the Maytag fortune behind him, so he kind of had different motives for starting a brewery. But most of these guys were homebrewers who were like, we can finally come out of the closet now, like we're not illegal anymore, because it was just an oversight in language that made home winemaking legal after Prohibition, but not home beer making. It was just an oversight, but guess what? If you don't have a lobby, you don't change a law. And the people who were homebrewing in the closet illegally did not have a lobby. And so that law really didn't get changed for a very long time when it should have. And that's really what sparked it.
So we talked about the science of making beer. Let's talk about the science of enjoying beer. What's the best way of pouring a beer? And do glassware really make a matter or make a difference? And if so, your best beer, what type of glass would you want it served in?
I mean, there are recommendations for every style of beer, and I guess it depends on personal preference. I do believe that the glass does make a difference. Up to a point, I think that there are certain styles that don't necessarily have to have the exact glass, but at least something similar. For us, Budweiser in a traditional pint glass or straight glass would be the best way to enjoy it. And pouring does matter. So when you pour Budweiser, you want to pour on the opposite wall. If I had one, I'm out of beer, but I can't pour anything right now. But if I had one, I would
Another round for the host.
Yeah, there you go. If I had one, I would pour the Budweiser on the opposite wall and make sure that you break the CO2, because the carbonation in there is kind of holding in some of the aromas and the flavors that you really want to enjoy. And it's also, going to make you full when you drink it. So you want to kind of release that carbonation. When you taste, you also want to swirl it a little bit if you don't have any more carbonation, and just continuously release. You'll see now like a big thing with etched glassware, and that's really to create the nucleation point to release that CO2 continuously, so you can enjoy the aroma of the beer the entire way through.
Like one good example is the glass I have. It's really good for beers where you want to trap a lot of the aroma, because it gets narrower at the top. So that, like, if you look at the way it keeps the aroma in or lets it out, that's one aspect of it. If it's very tall and thin, you can see the bubbles, and you can, so it definitely glassware matters for depending on style.
I think the most important thing is it's never appropriate to use a frozen shaker glass.
I disagree. Drink it however you like it.
Hi, my question's for Cheryl. We were talking before the session started tonight about it being a minor in beer, is it beer studies? And can you talk about the science? If I were to sign up for your program, what are the science classes that I would take, or what do I need to already know?
So it's a minor. So that means if you're an undergraduate at a university, you have a major, and then sometimes you can add on a minor. So we don't have a major in brewing. So you'll still stick with whatever major you chose, your business, engineering, science. I have a weird number of anthropology students this year. And they could add on a minor, and a minor is an additional 5 classes, and 3 of those classes are brewing, and then they take a business class, and they take history of beer as well. So, but in addition to that, so what I really like about it is that any student can take it. I have engineering students. One of them went to go intern at Anheuser-Busch last summer, and that he loved it. He thought it was really great. I have a couple anthropology students. One is currently helping someone else open a brewery. The other one's packaging line at Stoneface. I've got a agriculture student who is now running the farm at Northwoods Brewery, growing hops and also helping them brew. So I really like that I can get every possible student in because there are all those jobs in breweries. It's not just being a brewer, and that's something I tell them all the time. Anyone can take the classes. You don't have to be an undergraduate. So if you live in the Durham area and you have, Monday, Wednesday, Friday from 3 to 5 available, you can take the class. It's open to anybody. It's open to continuing ed as well. And I'm in the College of Life Science and Agriculture, so it is very heavy on the science aspect. And the subcategory is I'm in the Sustainable Agriculture and Food Systems department. So I do focus quite a bit on the agriculture of the ingredients as well. And a lot of my students are sustainable agriculture students. So we go into, there's not just jobs in the brewery. There's jobs on the farm. There's malt house, all the things leading up to that. And then there's all the jobs that come after the brewery, the distribution and the marketing and everything like that.
Climate change is affecting beer. How is climate change affecting your business, or how do you see it affecting it in the next coming years? So whoever wants to start, maybe Cheryl, you've thought about it more than most.
Yes, we do think about this a lot in my class. Specifically in the advanced class, we have a 2-week module where the State of New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services comes and teaches for me, which is awesome. And we talk about a lot of aspects of sustainability. One thing we are trying to do is work with the different breweries on benchmarking their energy usage and trying to have them understand where they stand against other breweries of their size and how they can reduce their water, electricity, fuel consumption. But so in addition to that, though, like going back to the whole agriculture aspect of it, if you can't grow the ingredients, you won't have beer. So we talk a lot about the farm, the impacts there, and where things are being grown and how they're being affected.
Before I opened a brewery, I didn't realize the ungodly amount of water we use. It's just insane. And I've heard other breweries like Jester King down in Texas, we're there in Austin. We're lucky to be up here where there's a lot of water. Down there, man, it's dry. And they're always trying to lower, the 2 barrels of water to every barrel of beer they produce, which I don't see how they can do it, frankly. I don't know how you'd wash anything. But I feel guilty every day when I'm using that water again.
I think some of the easiest ways for us to deal with that is efficiencies inside. There are ways that you can sort of say, all right, well, I've already embedded energy into this thing. How can I now extract it before I dispose of this thing so I'm at least getting 2 uses out of that heating of the water? Because we had to heat the kettle once. Now we got hot water. Why don't we put it down the drain just so that I can heat up more water to clean the kettle? At my scale, at least, that's kind of where our limitations are. We don't source hops locally because it's really problematic. The big challenge with hops is infrastructure. They're extremely fragile, and if you don't immediately dry them and package them in vacuum flushed with nitrogen after pelletizing them, they're really difficult for brewers to use, and they're not going to maintain their integrity if you don't freeze them right away. If they're fresh, you really got to use them in about a day or a day and a half, and they immediately start to break down once they're off the vine. Working at Throwback, I'm sure you could probably speak to this even more because most of your ingredients were sourced from, less than 200 miles away. That's a challenge to do on a production scale.
Yeah, at Throwback, we were operating and they still are, about 80% local ingredients. But what I was going to add to that is, that I forgot to mention before, is that grain and hops grow in very specific regions well. And hops, especially very narrow regions, north and south. And So extreme weather events really impact that, just like they would impact grapes for wine. So you hear about that a lot more with wine, I feel like, but it happens absolutely with beer. If you're having droughts in certain regions or you're having extreme weather because of climate change, that will very much impact the brewers down the line. It'll impact us basically because of cost. If those hop farmers have to now irrigate the entire season or they lose a whole crop, it's going to impact us because we can't get the hop we want, or it's going to cost us 10 times as much to get it from somewhere else. And that is a cost that we have to figure out if we pass on to our customers.
So I have a question about yeast. I know that ABI, you guys have a whole lab doing all that kind of stuff for you, but for the smaller breweries, are you guys doing like fresh pitches every time? Are you repitching? Are you trying to propagate your own? How do you handle yeast?
Yes and yes. We we do harvest yeast when we can. It adds a step in the brewing process at the end of fermentation where we want the yeast to drop down so we can get it. It adds days on, maybe 5 days sometimes. And so we don't always have that time. Right now we're in a crunch just trying to get beer out. So we buy a fresh pitch. That's easier, but it's way more expensive. We specialize in New England IPAs. And that style, you know, you want it hazy, milky almost sometimes. We find we have to hit it with a lot of yeast, and it better be healthy yeast. If we try to harvest the yeast too many times, then it doesn't work. So we're a little gun shy to make a mistake right now. So another reason why we're doing fresh yeast. When we get caught up and we can have some more time, we can harvest the yeast in a way that we trust it and we can use it again, probably for a few generations.
We're in the same boat because we, half of what we make, more than half of what we make is New England style IPAs. And the yeast requirements for that style are, there's a couple of really specific characteristics that you need. You need to have a yeast that doesn't flocculate. So when it's done, it kind of clumps and drops, and that's why beer gets clear, especially if you make the beer cold. You put the yeast to sleep after it's done eating, and it all just clumps up and falls asleep at the bottom, and you get clear beer left over. You want a yeast strain that doesn't do that as readily because some of that yeast staying in suspension actually carries along with it a lot of the volatile aromatics from the hops, the aroma, the flavor. They get bound in the fat in their cell walls, and if they all dropped out, you'd lose a lot of the hops that ended up going into the beer in the first place. You also need to have a yeast strain that can do what's called biotransformation, which means it's taking stuff in the hops and it's turning it into other stuff. You have to use hops that have those precursor chemicals, the first stuff, and you have to use yeast strains that can turn the first stuff into the second stuff and do that biotransformation. So it's very tricky, and you find it after a certain number of generations of using London 3. It's pretty much the standard for the style that you'll get genetic drift. And beyond 5 or 6 generations, you will start to have yeast that will flocculate when you don't want it to, or you'll get phenolic overtones where you're getting clove or medicinal tones that you absolutely do not want to happen. So we're using 5 to 6 generations of London 3 checking on viability. A lot of our other stuff, we're using dry yeast. We're actually using what they call Chico or 05, which is a very neutral ale yeast that doesn't put off much flavor at all or much aroma. A lot of people don't realize that a huge piece of a lot of styles of beer come from the yeast, the aroma and the flavor. This was designed, I don't know if it was designed by, but it's what Sierra Nevada uses for almost all of their beers, and it doesn't impart much at all into the beer itself. We use that for styles that don't really require any kind of flavor contribution from the yeast, and because I can buy it dry versus having to buy a liquid fresh pitch. We buy it looks like a coffee brick. It's a vacuum sealed 500-gram package, and it's fairly inexpensive. You're talking $120 for a 15-barrel batch versus $900 for a pitch for a 15-barrel batch, which is what we pay for London 3. If you use fresh yeast, it will probably be your most expensive ingredient, even if you are doing a very hop-heavy, high-alcohol, heavy-grain IPA. Your yeast will still probably be one of your most expensive ingredients.
I think one of the big things to understand also is how each yeast strain is going to act. So we have 5 yeast strains that we deal with in Merrimack, and each of them has different properties. One's more stable than the other. One you have to repitch immediately. They also have different shelf lives. So, some of them we can repitch 10 times, and some of them we can repitch 2 or 3. So really just understanding the properties of each yeast. Is it going to flocculate? Is it not going to flocculate? Is it going to flocculate when it's warm? Is it going to be dormant and still be, revitalized after? Like each of those different properties is very important to understand. We are lucky to have a culture yeast center. We do have a supply of yeast, but we also need to control our process and make sure that we're reusing the yeast the best that we can, and understanding that yeast has a memory, like you mentioned, so it's going to remember what kind of sugar it ate, and if it ate glucose and it's really used to eating glucose, and then you try to give it a more complex sugar, it's going to struggle a little bit, and it's going to get really tired, and it's not going to work that great. So just understanding what you're trying to have your yeast do is also important, and what its capabilities of the yeast are. Also, it's flavor carryover, it's color carryover. If you put it in a black lager and then you try to pitch it into a Bud Light, you're going to have some issues because it's going to carry some color. Also, if you try to pitch it into like a 75 IBU beer and you're trying to go into a, summer ale that should have like 10 IBUs, you're going to have some hop flavor carryover. So what you're trying to reuse the yeast for is also as critical as understanding how your yeast acts and what properties are of the yeast.
I heard someone say, what is flocculate? It's when the yeast, you cool a beer down, the yeast sort of like settles out and leaves a clear beer behind. So if you think of like snow just kind of falling. I don't know what the original question was, but I heard yeast, so we're just going to go from there. Repitching. No, that wasn't the original question.
The gentleman asked about
Oh, okay. Well, I'm just going to talk about something else about yeast. So I have the students, they learn about repitching. We don't brew enough to be able to repitch, but they are learning how to propagate yeast from small amounts. And then the other thing we're doing is they learn how to harvest yeast from the natural environment. So kind of like the Belgians do with a cool ship, we put out a cool little mini cool ships. We see what lands in it, and then they plate all that in the microbiology lab. They propagate that up. And one of the many hundreds of projects that I'm trying to work on with them is to see if we can't find our own proprietary yeast strain at UNH on one of the agricultural fields that UNH owns. Hasn't happened yet, but we do have the Hubbard Genome Center at UNH Durham. So when we find what we think might be a unique yeast strain, we're able to do the DNA analysis and sequence the genome to find out if it's actually a new strain of yeast. And if it is, then I think there's like people at UNH who have to get involved with like stuff, trademarking.
So in the beginning, we established that there were quite a few people that were not home brewers here in the crowd. And after the wonderful presentation you guys have given, a few people now said, hey, we want to make our own beer at home. If you each had to give only one piece of advice to a new home brewer, what would it be?
Charlie Papazian, Joy of Home Brewing. And for you more science-y people, John Palmer, How to Brew.
Clean everything. If you think you clean it again, because you probably didn't do it right. And you're going to have an infection, and that will be bad.
Yeah, I was going to say keep it clean and keep it simple, I think is how to do.
Take notes. If we're coming from a scientific standpoint and you really want to have an empirical approach to designing and refining your recipes, and you really are going to substitute one recipe or change one variable at a time, if you don't take good notes, there's no way you're ever going to know that. And it's so easy to do now. There's free software that's super intuitive and very simple to use. And then there's really complicated stuff that you can geek out with pivot tables if you're really the engineering type, and you can extrapolate all kinds of data points that you want to. It was essential for us to revisit what we had done as home brewers and how we wanted to formulate our business plan, because we had all of those notes. We had used software from almost the onset of our brewing, and we'd taken really, really, really good notes. And so I can actually pull something out of the cellar from 10 years ago, and I can look at how we made it and what we pitched and pretty much every detail on almost every recipe that we did. And that is ultimately, we're all here to make the same beer at least once. I mean, maybe our whole thing is that we're going to always have different recipes, but you're going to come to a point where people are going to expect continuity from you, whether it's your rotating IPAs that have that one variable changed of the hop, but the grain bill and the underlying skeleton are the same, or whether it's the Bud Light that I had in Beijing that tasted just like the one I had in Merrimack. There's going to be that level of expectation from your consumers, and you have to be able to meet that even if you're just going to be Joe Blow brewing in your garage and you really want to impress your friends, they're going to say they like it because it's free. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But there's no way to know unless you took the notes.
Yeah, I want to change my advice. It's find a way to control your fermentation temperature. We talked about yeast. This brings us back. Michael talked about Kveik yeasts, which are the Norwegian farmhouse yeasts. Those have special properties that they can ferment at any temperature, basically, and tastes fine. If you use English ale yeasts and you let that go hot, you'll get maybe weird fruity flavors. Maybe you'll like them, but they taste very different than if you kept it down at 65 degrees. So either brew Kveiks or control the temperature. Or Saisons you can ferment hot.
That's another reason we used to brew a lot of them.
Yeah. That's a good summer beer, which is when they brewed, right?
I'd like to get a step beyond whatever you like and observe that there's a certain population of people who only drink their beer cold, called Americans, and there are others who think that's insane. Are there, so focusing on the science, are there flavors or techniques that are, I'll say, especially rewarding for beers that are drunk cold or for beers that are drunk at room temperature? Are there things that are more noticeable, more robust, more enjoyable, one way or the other, assuming it's not about cooling you down just because it's July?
I would say doubtless that I think the Saison is not as good now that it's warmed up a bit. It was really nice when it got to my glass at like 48 degrees. You know, it was probably poured at like 42. It was good up to about 50, and now it's starting to taste like a warm Saison. I have a feeling that Shock Top would probably be the same. But talking about an English barley wine, it's a big beer. It's probably going to be in 16-ounce cans because that's about the only thing we package in. So I'd probably pour that into a glass and spend an hour and a half or 2 hours with that glass and find that about halfway through it was perfect. Because a bigger beer like that, it's going to open up. The warmer a liquid gets, the more the aromatics, the volatiles, come up off of the surface and into your nose, giving you the olfactory experience that you want. And a lot of the flavors actually open up too. I think that it's probably an oversimplification, but the higher alcohol and the more malt forward a beer is, generally speaking, the better it's going to be as it gets closer to room temperature. I don't know that any beer really tastes good at 70, but you get to the 60, 65 range, and a big stout just opens up and you get levels of complexity that you would never get if you pull it right out of the fridge and started drinking it right away, just because the cold is going to hide a lot of that complexity.
Yeah, I agree. One of my favorite things is cask beer, and it's really cool if you're ever at a brewery that does this. I know there's some that do where you'll brew your batch beer, but you'll take a little bit off, put it in a cask, and then serve them side by side. So you do the cask versus draft thing, and it's really neat to see the difference in the aroma and flavor profiles of that. But like you said, all the aromas come out when it's like a porter on cask. It's perfect.
So we never really did get into the packaging and distribution, though we just started on that. And the last one of these we had, they were talking about how particularly aluminum cans are becoming better for a couple of reasons. A, they're lighter, cost less to transport. B, brown bottles doesn't really make a whole lot of difference. It's just, hearsay. And they line the cans, the aluminum cans, with some special plastic. And do they do the same thing with casks?
Well, I'll start. So the color of the glass does actually make a difference. It restricts the amount or the light waves that can come in contact with the beer, and essentially will protect against the amount of light struck notes that can be in the beer. So the light will interact with some of the hop oils and will create light struck or skunky notes. So if you ever have like a European beer that's traveled a long way in a green bottle, that might be something that you might get some skunky notes off of. Not to say that they don't necessarily want that as part of their beer, but if you have a Heineken in the U.S., it's probably going to taste a little bit different than a Heineken in Europe. So the amount of light that is allowed into contact with the beer is restricted by the brown bottle, which is, most typically found part of glass. The can is, I would say, from a light perspective, definitely better because it's blocking everything, right? So you eliminate. So time, temperature, light, and oxygen are going to be the killers of the flavor of your beer. So how long it can retain its freshness, those are the four main components. So cans and aluminum bottles eliminate light as one of the components that will affect your shelf life of the beer. Temperature, we kind of talked about serving temperature, but not necessarily storage temperature. If you get your beer cold, don't let it warm up and then cool it again, because you will effectively age your beer faster. So if you get your beer warm and you put it in a fridge right away, then great. Your beer's going to be, more stable than if you bought it cold, let it warm up in your trunk, and then went home and put it in your fridge again, because you've basically simulated some aging properties of the beer. So I would say, cans have their benefit from a light perspective. They're easier, they're lighter to transport, they're, faster to run on a production line. The sealing for the lid is definitely better, so you have less oxygen than can get into your can, or when you tip it over, it doesn't leak, so you don't have oxygen really getting in as much. The only thing that cans, are a little bit worse than bottles would be the temperature transfer, so they will heat up a little bit faster. You might have to drink it a little bit faster. I didn't say that. Drink responsibly.
Decant.
There you go. Decant. There you go. But, there are benefits to both styles of package and the experience. Best experience for a beer is pouring it in a glass.
So regarding cans, aluminum versus glass, so there's definitely a lot of benefits to cans. More people recycle cans than they do glass in different parts of the country. But if, just as a side note, like if you're talking cradle to grave, so from where aluminum is mined and the process it goes through to become a can versus glass, the overall energy is higher for a can than it is for glass. But if you're talking about cans that are made from recycled content or glass that's made from recycled content, that changes that whole dynamic a bit. So it gets really complicated. The math, as far as what's more sustainable, gets really complicated if you talk about mining those original ingredients all the way to being recycled and turned into a new product. I think there's benefits to both, especially just on a consumer level. Like you can take cans hiking and and not break them, and they do protect against light. And just to speak to your other thing, and Summer's absolutely right, the color of the glass absolutely matters. And where people are getting a little confused is you might take certain clear glasses out in the sunlight and they don't skunk. And it'll happen within a few minutes, really. If you took craft beer out into the sunlight, it starts to get those skunky things. Or if you had green glass out in sunlight, it starts to get those skunky things. But there's ways now to use derivatives of hops to brew a beer that don't skunk. So you might have some beers out there that don't skunk, even though they're in a clear bottle. So that's where it might get a little confusing. But the color of the glass, especially with craft beer, absolutely, absolutely matters. And, you mentioned the BPA lining. Yes, they are lined often. Cans are lined with plastic, BPA plastic. And so that's why our beer doesn't taste like metal, though, anymore.
And I'm pretty sure casks are stainless. At least the ones that we have feel like they're the same material as our kegs. If they feel way too heavy to be aluminum.
All right, so please join me in thanking this exceptionally good panel. Thank you for your generous support. We really appreciate your contributions. And next month, if you want to get on the email list, go to sciencecafenh.org, and there's a place where you can get on our email list. And next month, the topic is really a good one. It's one I think, it's about addiction. But there's a lot of addicts probably in this room. It's about digital addiction. So be here for that. Thank you all for coming.